Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sofia Mesquita, and I'm a first-year MBA student at Columbia Business School. This will be our last panel of the day, concluding the rich discussions that have taken place during the second edition of the Brazil Climate Summit. I'm excited to announce our keynote speaker, Andrew Winston, a Columbia alumni, one of the most widely read writers on sustainable business in the world, and co-author of Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. Andrew wrote it with Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. The book is a fascinating account of how businesses can and should profit by fixing the world's problems, such as climate change, inequality, and the biodiversity crisis. Please welcome to the stage, Andrew Winston.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to move now into the last session back in English, and I think this time we also want to give a chance to those of you in the auditorium to ask some questions to Andrew before we wind up, so we'll give you time to do that in a moment. As said in the introduction, Andrew's an expert on corporate sustainability, co-authored with Paul Pullman, who those of you who were here last year will remember spoke to us at last year's summit, that book, Net Positive, setting out how companies can profit by fixing the world's problems instead of creating them. So, Andrew, tell us first, maybe, what does the business case for sustainability look like today, and how's that changed over the past decade or two?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the summit for inviting me to be part of this after that kind of impressive panel where to see the kind of current political leadership and, as far as I can tell, the future leader of the world, Amanda, I think she'll be in control at some point, which is great for all of us, I think. The world would be probably a lot better off. So, look, we're in a really interesting time on corporate sustainability, and first of all, I'm not going to claim to have any specialized knowledge on Brazil sustainability, but I have spent some time there, but can't. I think that this is a little bit like the children's game of one of these things is not like the other. Everyone's a Brazil expert, and then I'm coming in as a corporate expert. I mean, we're in a really different time, like for everything, but especially what it means to be a business. And I've been in this overlap of business and society for 20 or so years. About a couple years after I left here, when I got my MBA, and I got into this field. And we've been fighting this battle to get sustainability on the corporate agenda for a long time, and I'd say we won. That's kind of the good news. And there is no large company in the world that says nothing about sustainability. There's no large company in the world that's denying climate change. Even if you go to Exxon's site, they talk about climate change. Doesn't mean they want to do much about it, but that's a different conversation. What's changed is that it's now on the agenda for a series of reasons because the megatrends, the things that have been driving this for years, are really very tangible. Climate change has moved from being a model that was to be debated and people could debate the data to something that's happening, right? It's happening right now in Hawaii, in California, in Libya, in Pakistan. It's just on and on and on. And so it's on the corporate agenda, but the level of kind of commitment and ambition that companies have is still lagging, right? Just as we heard before, the level of commitment and ambition of countries is still lagging what we need. And companies are really, I think, no different in many ways. They take their cue from the national commitments and they kind of don't go any faster, really.
Right, so no doubt about climate change or corporate commitment to sustainability, but what about that troublesome acronym ESG that's become a bit of a political football in the US? I mean, has ESG had its day?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to distinguish between ESG, which is a financial world term, right? It came out of the financial world. It is about screening companies, looking at businesses as investments, understanding the risk to them. It's not the same thing as sustainability. They're related, but they're not the same thing. So you don't have much of the investment world actually assessing businesses on how much they contribute to a better society. They're just looking at them from a perspective of how much risk is there to the company, say, or to a sector, which leads you to some weird things where you have an oil and gas company getting a high ESG rating because they might be doing well from within their sector. So it's not a measurement of what they're doing for the world. ESG has and we can spend some time on this. ESG as a phrase has been taking a lot of heat in the U.S. and I get questions about this all over the world. I travel a lot, and speak to groups and media across the world, and this debate about ESG has kind of swept the world. But I think it is really critical to distinguish between this phrase that's turned into a regulated issue, a reporting issue, and what investors are looking at, and the issues of sustainability and the underlying problems that are driving concerns about sustainability. And they're two very different things.
Right. And when we're talking about how we measure companies and assess what they're doing, a lot of companies are claiming that they're setting goals to be net zero. Some say they already are net zero. But of course, when they say that, a lot of them are using offsets. Right. So how real is all this, and how should we measure it? Is it just a big greenwashing exercise? I guess
I'm someone who doesn't cry greenwash too often. I think true greenwash companies lying, flat out lying, is pretty rare. I think there's cases like VW that invented whether their cars were greener or not. I mean, that was actual fraud, right? I mean, that was not just greenwashing. I don't think it's actually that common. I think what companies do, though, is quite frequently they overstate something that they're doing that just isn't all that important to their total footprint. So, for years, banks would talk about, we're going to paper-free billing or paper-free, monthly statements, which has nothing to do with their real footprint. And so I think there's not that much actual greenwashing. But, the companies are claiming, to be net zero because of offsets in large part. And I think there's a lot of companies stepping back from that, realizing it doesn't quite cut it. I'm not so worried about that because, as I think you've heard from some of the other sessions, the speed of change on the solutions that we're looking at, the speed of change on renewables, on electric vehicles, on all those is so quick and so exponential that companies and countries, we're going to get to the zero place quicker than we realize. And so I'm not so worried about the claims right now, as long as companies are continuing to invest and be transparent and public about their commitments. But the reality is it's just more economic now, so I don't really worry that companies are going to avoid doing what's cheaper.
So the companies are trying to do the right thing, but I mean, these offsets, is there a solution to that problem? Do we regulate it better? Do we just forget about it? Do we hope that over time it goes away? What's the answer on offsets?
There's a huge range in what is an offset, right? And there are high quality offsets, and I think Brazil is right in the heart of nature-based solutions, putting some kind of value on nature in a way, creating markets for that. Those are the kinds of offsets in the future that will be of high value forever, right? There's always going to be remaining pieces of the climate equation that are hard to mitigate, and we're going to need some version of very high quality offsets. So it's not like the idea of them will go away, but something like buying the renewable energy credit from a wind farm is really going to die out pretty quickly because it just has no value. So I think that stuff that's got real value is when it's based in nature, when it's clear that it isn't, and these are hard things to measure, that it is additional carbon that's being saved, right? That it is something, an instrument that is creating real change in how we do something in terms of mainly how we treat the land. Are we rejuvenating, regenerating the land? Are we finding ways to take land that's been fallow and out of use and find good use for it, or use it as a carbon sink? Those things are going to keep evolving, and I think there's going to be more and more tools and markets for putting values on that. And that is going to be legitimate offsets for companies.
When we think about how companies get to a genuine net zero, for a lot of companies, of course, the supply chain is a crucial part of this, and being able to audit the supply chain. And there's still, I find, looking around the business world, an awful lot of companies that claim they can't properly audit their supply chain. It's too long, it's too complex, there's too many countries and companies involved. How do we tackle this problem of the supply chain?
Yeah, look, it is, everything they say is true. It is really difficult, and for companies with very long and elaborate supply chains or tens of thousands of suppliers, getting the data is really challenging, and it is a huge problem. But I think we are approaching this kind of mythical point that's been mythical, but we're approaching where if there's more and more actual regulation and kind of de facto regulation in terms of companies pressing their suppliers to measure your own footprint, then as more and more companies get a handle on their own emissions and get transparent about it, then scope 3 becomes trivial, right? If you've got more and more of your suppliers who just have their data in place, and there's more and more regulation about that, which there is, California's talking about passing something, that mandates Scope 3 reporting. You've got a German supply chain transparency law that just went into place. The EU with their corporate reporting, the US SEC. This is moving fairly quickly. And so the tools are going to fall in place because there's increasingly regulation, and there's going to be money in the SAPs and Accentures of the world helping you solve this problem and create the tools and do the measurement. Like, this is an entire market that's being created now, and it's going to grow, just like the market for measuring financial statements turned into a multi-trillion-dollar business. That's what's going to happen on ESG metrics, supply chain, Scope 3. These are evolving, and we will get the tools in place. And I think eventually, hopefully quickly, Scope 3 will be kind of easy to do.
I mean, you can see how that might work in the US or Europe, that regulation and that stricter reporting and compliance. But what happens when you get down to the level of, say, the Brazilian state of Pará? The Governor Barbalha was telling us in the last session that, cattle ranching is an important part of Pará's economy. How are you going to audit effectively the supply chain in somewhere like Pará?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I wish I had. Can we skip to some easier questions? You're really digging into. No, I mean, look. The further back you go, the smaller the businesses, the more family-run, the more local. Obviously, it's going to get more difficult. But there have been shortcuts or ways to think about this going on in lots of different sectors. In the food and agriculture business, there's very few farms that are measuring their exact carbon emissions, but there are studies by crop in certain regions, and so they use certain numbers as proxies. This is how we do a lot of emissions, calculations. As you say, okay, we have a pretty good sense this is how much emissions come out of growing a tomato in this region. So if we buy this many, that's roughly how much emissions, right? I think that's going to happen, and it has been happening in a lot of different products. We're not going to get to every little place in the world has the exact numbers. But there's going to be very good proxies and measurements, and the big guys are going to measure their footprint, and the little ones are going to be estimated, right? And I think that's fine, as long as it's, not within an order of magnitude, but within, some reasonable percentage of reality. I mean, part of what really matters here is that, getting the exact number of your Scope 3 is not as important as knowing where the footprint is. And actually, we've come very far in that in the last 15, 20 years. For most product categories, there's really good information about where is the big footprint. So a company like Starbucks comes out with their sustainability plan a few years ago and says, okay, we want to reduce our total Scope 3 and total carbon, so we actually have to look at milk. They figured out about 21% of their total emissions was not the stores, was not shipping, it was dairy. And so if they encourage their customers to go to alternative milks, so do I need the exact number to know that they should be encouraging customers to go to alternative dairy? No. That as long as they're working on the biggest buckets, then it's not greenwashing, right? It is back to the previous point, and it's getting us in the right direction. I think directionally correct is pretty good on this, and we will know at the macro level if emissions ever actually go down on the total level that it's coming together. So I don't think we need exact numbers. I'm not saying we just punt, but we can get pretty far knowing where the footprint is.
And Andrew, I'm sort of interested, we were talking a bit in some of the earlier panels about how much has changed over the last 20 years. I mean, from your personal perspective in this corporate sustainability business, 20 years ago, did you think we'd be where we are today? I mean, what's gone better or worse than expected for you?
Yeah, like I said, things have changed so much in the last few years that, I got into this 20-ish years ago, and I guess if I thought we'd still be debating climate change to some extent, I probably would have given up a long time ago. I get told now that I was early. I didn't feel early at the time. I thought it was pretty clear that climate change was serious. The data was there. There were companies talking about it. It wasn't completely new. I didn't think it would be this long. The reality is, I think we've gone, in some ways, no faster than the economics, meaning the reason we're moving so quickly now on renewables is because they got cheaper. I'd like to think it's because companies made commitments, but even Walmart, when they put out their 100% renewable, they were one of the first companies to say that 15 years ago. The asterisk, quite literally, in all their reports was, when it's economic, meaning as long as it was cheaper, they were going to buy it, which it's hard to believe that was a big statement, but it was. And so, in a way, we're just going still as fast as the economics. I don't see us accelerating quicker to be net positive, to go beyond, without, I think, some deeper change in what you heard from Amanda about the economic model, and I think what's expected of companies. And that is recently what's really changed. I think the expectations of companies and what they should be in the world, their role in society, especially from young people, what they expect of companies they're going to work for and buy from, is changing really quickly. And that gives me some optimism that the acceleration is actually coming.
So that's a really important point, isn't it, about moving as quickly as the economics allows. But there are things governments can do to tweak the economics, right? So carbon markets clearly is one of those. I mean, how big a role do you think the carbon markets can play in changing the economics to make all this happen more quickly? And do you think that's one of the main avenues, or are there others?
Yeah, I'd like to think there could be a global carbon market, and I think, a global carbon price. I mean, I have an economics degree. I think a carbon price has always been kind of the simplest way to drive change. It's been obviously really difficult. I don't think we're getting to anything like that soon. But what's happening instead is something like the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the kind of competition now globally on those things is just funneling huge sums of money towards the clean economy, which in effect helps bring the price down. Right? I mean, the reason the economics changed on all this is really that China invested so much and built out the largest industry for solar and wind the world had ever seen, and did what they did with apparel and electronics and just drove the price down. But now you've got some serious investment in the IRA and other bills around the world. And again, there's kind of this de facto price by companies demanding of each other, of their suppliers, that they manage, measure, and reduce their footprint. That creates, in effect, a price, because if you're not hitting those targets for your big customers, you're going to have more and more trouble getting business and doing business with them. So it does put a price on inaction. And so I don't think we're going to get to a global price politically, but I think it's kind of happening in pieces through these other forces.
Right, and that takes me to one other question which I'll ask you before we turn over to the audience. So get your questions ready. We're going to come to you in just a moment. One of the other things that's changed maybe is that the costs of inaction have risen, right? Companies used to say they can't afford sustainability, but now inaction costs more. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think we hit this tipping point a while ago, and it's kind of a main theme in my last book, which is that the cost of inaction is now much higher than the cost of action. I mean, look, I still hear, and you'll hear a lot of, in the kind of go slow climate crowd, they'll say, if we tackle climate change, it'll destroy the economy, which is just increasingly ludicrous. The climate change itself is destroying entire economies. We're seeing that happen real time. We're heading towards pretty significant parts of the world being uninhabitable, being either underwater too much to live in, or too hot to work and be productive in, or to live in. And so clearly that's a huge expense. But the part of the reason the equation has flipped is because, as I said before, the change in the cost of the solutions, of renewables, of battery storage, has dropped exponentially. And we are just, as a species, just inherently bad at exponential. We just have trouble seeing it. And in fact, it's kind of built into our systems. Like the International Energy Agency puts out their projections, and they always project linearly, and they keep being wrong. Like every year for like 15, 20 years, they have to keep adjusting that solar's going like this, right? Instead of like a little bit up at a time. So the exponential drop in the price of stuff now means it's just cheaper to be going down this path. Now, it doesn't mean we go quick enough. It doesn't mean it happens. There's a lot of inertia in the system. There's huge vested interest slowing things down. The story used to be climate's not happening. Then it was like it's way too expensive. Now the kind of coherent story you hear from the go slow crowd has been, yeah, but EVs have lithium, and there's batteries, and there's a footprint to building an EV, and solar has a footprint, and yeah, everything we build has a footprint. It's like a completely specious argument, right? Yes, we're not having magical fairyland energy coming in that costs no footprint. It's drastically smaller footprint over its life cycle than fossil fuels. But the story being told now is, hey, don't go too fast, right? From the vested interests who have just immense sums of money and power and tens of trillions of assets under the ground at risk, right? We're going to leave all that in the ground, and that is worth a lot of money to the big fossil fuel companies and the petrostates. And there's no way for us to tackle climate without leaving all of that in the ground. So, people think, well, if it's so profitable, why doesn't it go faster? Because there's enormous forces trying to slow it down, right, all the time. And we're used to doing things the way we do them. It's hard to change sometimes, right? I think we're now getting used to EVs. People are buying them more and more, but it took a while, right, for people to feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Well, let's open it up to the audience. You've all been listening patiently. Can we have some questions? I think you were first over there, the lady in the stripy top. You want to give us your question?
Thank you. So, oops. I think it's an invite for me to stand. So I worked in agribusiness and then in sustainability and now in conservation and environmental conservation, which to me was like a natural evolution. So my question to you, Andrew, is what do you see in terms of the language of conservation for companies as part of the sustainability conversation? Because conservation goes a little bit beyond sustainability, and I wonder what corporations are doing or talking about that.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I as a writer, I think a lot about language and how we talk about things. And look, I feel like the reality is the way business talks about sustainability and even biodiversity and conservation is generally the business case. It is generally in terms of, look what nature does for us. It provides medicines. It provides, protection on the coast. It's always in this very kind of like economic terms without any kind of inherent value for nature and species in and of themselves, right? We're always converting it into business value as to kind of get business people on board. I think there's some shift in that as we see the language of net positive and regenerative, reparative move into business. Walmart has said they want to be a regenerative company, and they're working on what does that mean. And so they said we're going to save 50 million acres, right? That's not for their business, right? That's on principle and trying to kind of offset their land impact. So I think the language around, why do we protect land and ocean is evolving, right? It's still really hard to get it out of the economic mindset, as is all of this. Everything's always put in terms of what does this do for the economy, for GDP, for jobs, and not even in terms of just well-being, right? How does it make us happier? How does it make the world safer and more just? So I think it's changing somewhat, but I wouldn't kind of wait too long it's going to take a long time, I think, before companies are talking about natural resources in a way that's not still about the economic value.
Just while we're on that language, Andrew, are you a fan of global heating rather than global warming?
I guess I don't know if it really matters that much. I guess I've come around to climate crisis as a pretty good global heat. Look, the crisis is always good. The problem with global warming has always been that warmer sounds nice. It's a nice warm day out. It just hasn't been that good as a scare tactic. Crisis is pretty good. Climate chaos, I think, is a pretty good description that some people use. There's so much debate about language. There is ESG versus sustainability. There's no perfect words. I think it's more about outcomes.
Action.
Yeah, it's more about, are you moving in the right direction, and do you understand, whether you call it a crisis or not, do you understand how big a deal climate is? And by the way, almost very few of us, I think, really have internalized what's really happening, because it's terrifying. So it's hard to internalize, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Next question from the audience. I think we had down here. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm Laura. I'm part of Schneider Electric Sustainability Business, which is one of the companies that are used as an example in the Net Positive book. I loved the book. I read it. But I'm from, I think, a different generation. Amanda's generation, who was here in the panel before. And as I said, I loved the book, but when I read it, I had the impression that it was obvious. I was like, yes, yes, we want businesses that serve society and the planet. Why would we want businesses that do less harm? We want businesses that thrive, that are successful, building a better society and helping the planet and, humanity. So my question to you, Andrew, is do you think we are still in the phase where we are convincing business leaders that this is the idea that we would like to go for, or everybody's already convinced and we are trying to implement it?
Yeah, I wish it was look, part of the reason I have any hope is, two things. It's kind of what's happening with the clean economy and the fact that young people are just like, well, of course. I wish that were the case. I think the people that are still in power in business, which are fundamentally, some boomers and Gen X, we are still convincing. I get asked, between kind of doing these kinds of things, speaking, media interviews, I get asked basically, well, doesn't sustainability always cost more? Why should we do this? I get asked that like daily for 20 years. I'm like losing my mind. And I'm having trouble actually having the conversation anymore because it's increasingly actually surreal to have to debate why we might want to act on climate or find the business case for the actions you do within your company. Find the best ways to act. But I still get asked all the time, why should we do this? Doesn't it always cost more? Isn't it a drag on earnings? I have to write things about it. I've been writing the same article periodically for years about, no, it's good for business. I wish we were at that point. And I think we're still caught in this very deeply felt kind of narrative of like the last 50 years that the purpose of business is maximizing profit. The purpose of an economy or a government is to maximize GDP and the stock market. That's it, right? And that was taught so deeply that it's really hard for business people to see that there might be something more. If you ask people, what's the purpose of business? The first answer is profit. Everyone, I think, deep down knows there's still something missing with that answer. Like, how could that be the only reason? But I think it takes change and pressure from people who see it very clearly, which right now is mostly the younger people, to come into companies and organizations and just say, this is what I think it means to be a business today. So if I could wait 20 or 30 years till Gen Z is actually running all the companies, it would be fine, but we can't, right? So the question is, how do you get that mentality into the people that are in charge today? And I think part of it is I always suggest companies go listen to their younger employees, or quite literally to their children. Some of the biggest change stories I've heard from individuals in companies has not really been the business case in the end. It's been that their kids talk to them. I hear that all the time.
So that seems a good moment to bring in leadership, no? So one way to change this is leadership. What does net positive leaders look like?
At core, they're courageous. I think we're missing so much courage right now. And we see it in the US in particular on the attacks on ESG, the attacks on the social agenda in particular. I know this is a climate summit, but the social and climate agendas are so intertwined. The inequality and climate agendas are just so, they move together. They are impacting each other. It's really difficult to get companies kind of focused on the scale of the challenge and the opportunity, and how fast we can really move. I don't know. What was the I got off on my own little world, my own little tangent about speed. Because that was what I was thinking about, was the speed that...
What the net positive leaders look like.
That they have to increase their speed and their scale and their commitment. So courage is the big one. I think, at core, it's also about just believing in partnership and being willing to invite in critics to say, hey, have some humility and say, we don't know the answer to this. We have to solve this problem together, and invite in the critics, the NGOs that are hanging banners on your building, and say, okay, let's listen, and listen to the younger people in your business and in your kind of value chain. It takes humility. It's not something that's valued in CEOs for the most part these days, but the ability to say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this, and we have to move in a different direction. So that takes courage, and the courage to push back on investors and say, I'm not going to worry about your quarterly profits right now. You know, we're going to build towards longer-term value. So, you know, at the core, it is courage, and we're missing that pretty badly in most institutions.
So courage and humility, let's hope we've got some of it in this room from the next generation of business leaders. Any more questions for those of us here? Yes.
Andrew, thank you very much. My name is Rodrigo. I'm a lawyer in Brazil. I work for a non-profit organization in Brazil, a network of lawyers. We have like 900 lawyers, only climate lawyers in Brazil, in Latin America. And I was listening to the conversation, and it catch me the attention in terms of the compensation issue when you talked about the fingerprint. And I understood that the most important question is related to where is actually the manufacturer and everything else is going on. But I think is great part of the conversation leans to the when. And this is, in terms of climate policies, very important to the debate, because mostly of the debates are quite related to who is going to compensate for the past in terms of what is happening right now. Do you think the companies understand this burden on their shoulder, and how we could address this issue in terms of like big policies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they might understand it, but they're going to fight it. I mean, again, if you come back to this story that a company believes its purpose is to maximize profits, then any attempt at liability, reparations, looking backward, they're going to fight because they think it's their fiduciary duty to their stakeholders, right? To their shareholders, excuse me. Yeah, got important distinction. To their shareholders, that they don't recognize that. I think, look, it's going to come through the legal system, right? I think in the state of Montana in the U.S., in an unusual move, right? A judge said that the kids were allowed to sue, basically, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. I don't know how impactful that's going to be in the end. I don't think the scale of these companies. Like I just saw the Fortune Global 500 list. Walmart's the biggest company in the world. Right below them is Saudi Aramco, and oil companies are like 10 of the top, 20. Saudi Aramco net income 159 billion last year, which would be the 40th biggest company in the world, just its profit. And there's so much money there that I don't think suing them is going to bring them down. I think it can slow them down. It creates a moral pressure that says these are the bad guys. Increasingly, then young people don't want to go work for them, right? It starts to kind of slow them down. In the end, what's going to bring them down is that we make fossil fuels irrelevant, not that we sue them out of existence, right? We make them irrelevant through economics and through choices from business and government that we're going to choose the clean economy path, and it's the cheapest one. So I think it's important to put that liability out there. So there is, just for kind of justice sake, and to say this is what you've done is wrong. I don't think that's going to be fast enough or is going to do it, but I think it's an important kind of cultural milestone to say this was the wrong path, and you should have some liability, even though it's not going to be enough money to make a huge difference.
Thanks, Andrew. So we're running out of time now. So I'm just going to ask a final concluding question, which is that we've got a climate crisis. We're not moving fast enough. What can the people in this room do to help improve that situation? What's the one thing you'd want people here today to do to make a difference?
Well, I don't know if there's one, but I guess if I boiled it down, it would be using your voice, and that can mean a lot of things. It can be voting is kind of the most obvious. Like, we have to have the right people in place. I mean, the elections, the Brazil and U.S. elections of 2020 were pretty critical to the future of humanity. Like, it's not an overstatement to say that those two elections, had they gone the other way, we would be in a lot more trouble globally, right? You'd have two of the biggest levers on do we tackle climate change going in the opposite direction, in addition to our democracy disappearing, which is another conversation. So I look, your voice, your vote, your vote as a consumer, obviously, but I think as a citizen, but as an employee, whatever, if there's students in the room, as you go out into the world, as you go into your organizations, it's just pushing them, right? Saying this is what is of value to me as your employee, as your community member. That has huge impact. I don't see companies. I think the thing that gets companies moving, besides like their investors and some of their customers, is their employees. You know, even the skeptical companies, they can't ignore when people don't want to come work for them unless they get their act together on this. So that's kind of the main thing I'd suggest.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Clear action agenda there.